Welcome, Professor. You probably know what we're going to do is Homer, and then Sophocles, and then, which was a surprise to somebody in the audience last night who's been reading a lot of Virgil. The third one is going to be on Herodotus. There's lots of time between now and Monday morning to get through Herodotus, so don't worry about that. Apologies for the first version of the reading list, which did indeed have Virgil on it, but not much sympathy for never reading any of the subsequent reading lists since. In terms of the Iliad, I'm not going to say a lot because we've got a lot to get through. We've got actually to get through from once upon a time in history through to the Renaissance, where we're ending up on the final lecture on Monday afternoon. So I won't hold you on, but in terms of doing the reading on the Iliad, I got to about here and found out what was going to happen at the end. So I kind of gave it up. It's a bit of a rough, rubbish novel, isn't it? Zeus says, Hector will cut down Patroclus, Sarpedon will get killed, Achilles is going to kill Hector, and the Greeks are going to capture Troy. Look, 15. Slight waste of money. Told me right that way up front, but there may be more to it than that. Ahuvia Kahane is going to give this lecture. We've brought in a professional to do the first one to get us off to a good start, and then it can go downhill as I tackle Sophocles and Herodotus. The next 2 days, and then Alan Hudson will be a professional to bring up the, that's at the end on the Renaissance. Ahuvia spoke about the ideas 2 years ago on a panel about the ancient Greeks. Sort of a big topic, and we've kept in touch since, and I'm very glad he agreed to do this. He's head of classics and professor of Greek at Royal University. He's got a couple of books coming out, one on the novel and the epic and the form. So he's interested in literature and its relationship to modernity and criticism. But he's also got a book coming out in September, on Homer, A Guide for the Perplexed. Which,
probably a couple of months.
Which hopefully we're going to get a bit of a preview of. And probably all I need to do in the way of introduction. We've got a high-tech lecture, but I'll let you take over. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I'm extremely pleased to be here. In many ways, far more pleased to be here than in my so-called professional capacity in the classroom. One of the absolutely fascinating things about being in this environment is that a lot of you, most of you, all of you are accomplished in a variety of, we were just over lunch talking about Freud and psychoanalysis with someone sat next to us, and as we were waxing lyrical and philosophical about it, he suddenly explained that he was a professional psychoanalyst. So there we were preaching to the people who probably knew better than ourselves, and that's absolutely delightful. And it's invigorating and it keeps me on my toes. And let me say, I will not speak from a script. I have a few slides for you. If you absolutely insist, then for purely academic reasons at some point, I am willing to wrap a bit of Homer for you in Greek, and I'll explain why I might do that. That's embarrassing as it is. But the point is, I'd like to keep it informal. If you at some point want to interrupt me, I'll try to keep my own words short. But if you want to, if you urgently want to interrupt me, then by all means, please do. This is not going to be a formal lecture from script. Let me just also say one quick word by way of preliminary, and that is if I at least think of Frank's very interesting words earlier today, then one of the things that emerges from his argument was a movement, for example, from authoritarian traditionalism to a discourse of freedom from an environment, an intellectual or conceptual environment in which the subject and the outside objective world are united, and it takes a certain historical development to split them. Well, I confess that I don't agree. I do agree that it's a hugely important historical narrative which people have been saying and have been living by. And we live our worlds and our lives by narratives, so they're not false. But they are, at least I would say to you, and I'm sure somebody would object to my own words, they are just narratives. We can change those narratives. And we can look at the world, including, for example, at freedom in the very beginning. And Homer here, it's not that I am going to give you a narrow lecture about Homer. It's that Homer here is an emblem of everything that is backwards looking, that goes back to the very beginnings of European culture and civilizations, and increasingly more than that. The first word of the Iliad is sometimes been described as the first word of European literature. It's certainly not that, because we know that things that have been there before that. But as a narrative, it's extremely important that this statement, whether it's true or not. I hope that. Let me just also, just to try and feel out you as an audience. Am I going to be preaching psychoanalysis here to an audience of professional psychoanalysts? You will have to guide me as to how much to explain or take things, or not take things for granted. Who, for example, has read the Iliad or bits of the Iliad or bits of the Iliad? It is a funny story because it begins 10 years after the whole thing has begun, only gives you, in fact, 51 days worth of narrative, and ends well before it barely mentions, despite what you said, Angus, the destruction of Troy. So what exactly is the story? In fact, that's something that I'll get to. I want to do very quickly 3 things. One is give you, in a few minutes, a kind of introduction to what Homer is and what the problem is. I'll then spend another few minutes trying to outline for you at least some possible core values in Homer, in what is sometimes called the heroic code, the way people live, believe, and behave in Homer. And then we'll launch into a brief discussion of what it might mean in Homer's world to either be acting freely, as it were, or in accordance with a predetermined pattern. You might call that pattern fate, or one's lot in life. And let's launch straight into it. The first part then is 4 confusing questions about Homer. If I had to give you Homer in a nutshell, I would say that it is confusing, and it is confusing because it is an irreducible, read my book, it's not me, lots of money, it is a long-standing thing. It's an irreducible paradox, mix of opposites. For example, Homer is the best known figure in antiquity. The figure, the name everybody knows, about whom nobody knows anything. And if you ask me, what do I know about Homer, then I would have to refer to Manuel and say, I know nothing. And that is a studied answer after 30-odd years of reading. So here we go. So who was he? Well, someone. He was no one. He was everyone, in the sense, and let me just give you an example. We could talk about, these are some poems from a classical anthology, they are in Greek, but here translated, about Homer. And it says, 7 cities vied to be the place of Homer's birth. Cumae, Smyrna, Chios, Colophon, Pylos, Argos, and Athens. So just about every well-known city in that. And if you ask, where was Homer born? The simple answer is just there. Who were his father and mother? They were A, B, C, D. Well, now, everybody knows that you cannot be born in two places, and yet somehow he gets, and the same thing with this other poem. And let me just give you, we have quite a few representations of Homer. These are either ancient Greek statues or more often Roman copies of Greek originals. And the one thing that you can see about them, and the Greeks always thought, if you asked, to the best of our estimate, if you asked an ancient Greek, do you think Homer was a real person? Aristotle, Plato. They would say, yes, absolutely. Herodotus, for that matter, he lived 900 years before me. I know exactly who he was. But if you look at the busts, heads, they're clearly different people. And he might as well be Homer Simpson as well. I'm told that Homer was Matt Groening's, the father, the real father of Homer Simpson. His father was called Homer, and that's why Homer Simpson is called Homer. But he might as well have been called Homer because, in a sense, he is everyman. He's an everyman, a modern everyman. So that's just one instance of the answer to the question of how should we handle Homer is that it's a paradox that we cannot ever pin down. And that replicates itself in a whole range of questions. Now, what's the story? Well, we just already mentioned this. The story of the Iliad is, in one way, very simple. There's a war. There's the story behind it. There's a war. There's a woman called Helen of Troy. She's the most beautiful woman in the world. She's married to Menelaus, who is king of Sparta. Three goddesses have a competition as to who is the most beautiful. In order to decide that, they choose a judge. That judge is Paris, Prince of Troy. And the means of determining is what? Bribe. You bribe the judge. And as it happens, Aphrodite bribes the judge by promising him Helen, the most beautiful woman in the world, wins the competition. Paris goes to Sparta, abducts or takes Helen, takes her back to Troy. The Greeks then assemble an army to get her back. They go to Troy. They fight there for 10 years. They ravage Troy, destroy it, and bring Helen back. Herodotus says that's not true, incidentally. Well, you already see that even in antiquity, people don't quite believe a canonical truth. That's to say, if we go back to what Frank was talking about, the power of tradition, well, that goes out the window the moment the word tradition is first uttered in the so-called tradition of the West. Here's the first few lines of the poem. What I've done here for you, and you can do this online, I'll show you perhaps at the end, is I've given you the Greek for those of you who can still remember bits of the letters from their early math, or maybe there are mathematicians in the audience. This is actually, you can read the Greek, and the important point here is it's song. This is not the books that we are holding, whether it's translation, that's not Homer. Homer is a song. And it goes, Me linae de tea pele adeo Achilles. Ulo mene, you can read it with me. Ulo mene yuri akaios alge eteke. It's got 6 beats, which is why it's called the hexameter. Pollas dicti musikas aidi proiapsen. Hero, now choose the Heloria Teukekides. How to pronounce it? I don't know. No. We have theories, but that's different from the truth. And then you have the translation. And the story, in fact, of the Iliad is just those 51 days. It ends before the destruction of Troy, and it begins well after the whole thing is started. And in the first line, it tells us that in fact it's not about the destruction of Troy, but about the anger of Achilles. And what happens is that at the beginning of the Iliad, a priest by the name of Chryses asks for his daughter back. The king, Agamemnon, refuses. The god Apollo gets really angry. He hits the Greeks with pestilence. They realize that they've done something wrong. They have to give the girl Chryses' daughter back. Agamemnon is really upset about that. He takes the hero Achilles' daughter. Achilles gets really upset about that, says, I'm not going to fight. That's basically the story of the Iliad, about how this hero, Achilles, moves away from battle, and then ultimately, because his friend Patroclus dies, goes back, and that's pretty much it. So all these judgments that you kindly pronounced earlier, Angus, do have something in them, at least if we're expecting a plain beginning, middle, and end of the story. Is it true? Well, we could talk a long time about it, but I'll spend just 1 minute. Here is a bit from the Iliad, where the poet asks the muses, who know everything, to tell him a story, and he says, we have heard, if you can see in line 486, only rumor. Well, the funny thing is that when he says, we only know rumor, he's using a word, and you can see it here. You can see this word kleos, and you can see it in the Greek, which is fame. It is the most important thing for heroes. Heroes are mortal. They live and they die. What is the one thing that can save you, as it were, from your fate as a mortal? It is doing great deeds. It is having those deeds sung and therefore becoming immortal in song and works. The funny thing is that the very same word that here is used to mean rumor is the word for eternal truth in the poetry of Homer. So again, is it true or is it not? Is it authoritative? Is it the book that dictates what everybody should do from the beginning of Western civilization or otherwise? Or is it just plain rumor which you can just overthrow later on? And last but not least, how to think of it. And as I said to you before, this is not Homer. Because Homer is not a book, and remember what Frank was saying about the book. In fact, Homer is, and anybody ever heard the term oral poetry? It's poetry that was composed, and these are long poems. The Iliad is over 15,000 lines long. And they were composed, most people, myself included, without the use of writing. And why am I telling you? How did they do it? Well, this is where I would like to introduce you to the Lego block. You get ready-made bits of ready-made expressions. For example, the name Odysseus, or the name Achilles. Swift-footed Achilles. Podas opus Achilles. You have a ready-made Lego block. And when the time comes for composing, a bit like a jazz musician. Any jazz musicians in the audience? A jazz musician does not invent things from scratch. It's a matter of years and years of practicing the bits and components so that when the time comes to sit at the piano or hold the saxophone in your hand, all you have to do, a bit like we just talk. How is it that a 3-year-old, who certainly has no university education, can produce what we call grammatically well-formed sentences? They do. And they don't use writing. They don't sit there, Mummy, can I have a bit of... No. They speak, and they speak fluently, and they speak well. And the same with Homer. But what comes out of that is that it's reinvented every time. So that this authority, and this is what I really want to tell you about as an underlying theme, this immense authority that we get, Homer, the single most important, most influential longest tradition of poetry that every other poet, Derek Walcott, Nobel Prize winner in Omeros, the Orange Prize winner just recently with Song of Achilles, a whole Troy, if you've seen Wolfgang Petersen's movie. All of this is in fact based on the authority of something that is reinvented every time we open our mouth, or at least every time the poet opens his mouth. And we know that because researchers, for example, in Yugoslavia, with Avdo Medjedovic, he was a singer pretty much like Homer at the beginning of the 20th century, late 20s. He too recreated these things. And if he sings the poem on one occasion, and it's, let's say, 500 lines long, he didn't write it, he sings it. And then after 10 years, the same guy comes and talks to him. And he says, sing me the same poem. And he sings it, and it's 5,000 lines long. It's clearly two different things. And yet, the question put to Avdo was, are you singing the same song? And his answer, yes, absolutely. Exactly the same song? Yes, absolutely. Word for word the same song? Yes, absolutely. So the short message, and this is the end of our section, is that everything you get about Homer is both absolute truth and tradition, but at the same time completely open to variation. And it's in this context that we have to start reading the values of Homer and, very briefly, the question of freedom. So, we don't have much time, and I certainly don't want to talk for all of that. I just want to sketch things out for you, and then we can discuss it or raise questions. So here are the values of Homer. Everybody in Homer needs a prize. And so when the priest at the beginning of the Iliad comes and asks for his daughter back, and when the Greeks are forced to give them because Apollo gets really angry, the king, whose prize is being taken away, says, and this is Agamemnon, the overall leader, he says, I'm willing to give her back if such is the best way. I myself desire that my people be safe, not perish. Find me then some other prize that shall be my own, lest I forgive the language of the translation here, lest I alone among the Argives are the Greeks, go without, since that were unfit. Now why does he think that? It's not that he's so greedy. And this is, you take 1 minute, you understand that, you understand what we call the heroic. The prize is a symbol of what? Of achievement. Why do heroes want the recognition of achievement? Because they're mortal. And because if they achieve, and if that achievement is recognized, first by prizes, and if everybody knows about the prizes, then what will happen? A poet will come along and sing of the great deeds of the hero. And those words, the hero will die. But the words are what we call imperishable, what Homer calls imperishable fame. Kleos, that word we met earlier, which is a bit funny because it could also mean rumor. Aptiton, imperishable. So, you lose the prize, you lose your shot at immortality. And immortality, and rather mortality, is the whole deal in Homer. It's the human question. What are we here for, and how is it that we pass away, and what can we do to confront our own passing away and mortality? That's in a sense why Homer is so great, because he addresses this basic question, which we'll link in a moment, to the question of freedom, because somebody help me out here. If we're mortal, then that's linked to the question of what dictates in antiquity sometimes our mortality, the idea of predetermined fate. Well, if everything is predetermined, if we're all running and living by our fate, we might as well sit down. It goes back to, or forward if you want, to Jean-Paul Sartre, which he answers in a totally different way. I thought, oh, maybe not, we'll see. And the same thing, Achilles' mom, Thetis, she's a goddess. But unfortunately in Homer, if your dad or your mom is immortal, but your other parent is mortal, then you don't get immortality. You die like everybody else. And the problem is that Achilles' prize gets taken away from him by Agamemnon, whose prize was taken away from him to begin with. So now Achilles finds himself in this embarrassing situation where he's going to die and there's no remedy for it. And he says to his mom, can you please talk to the big kahuna, Zeus? And Thetis does that. And she says, now give honor. Honor is important, but not in a primitive so-called way. Honor is important because it is one of the routes towards what? Towards addressing our problem of mortality. You have honor, you have prizes, you have poems written about you, you have poems written about you, you get a shot at immortality. So she says to Zeus, this is Achilles' mom, Thetis, speaking about her son to Zeus, who is the king of the gods. Now give honor to my son, short-lived beyond all other mortals. Since even now the lord of men, Agamemnon, dishonors him, who has taken away his prize and keeps it. And Achilles, when his prize is taken away from him, if you've read the Iliad, he decides to withdraw from that. He says, you're going to take away my prize? And we can understand, it's not that he's angry. He loves his prize. Her name is Briseis. She's a captive of war, which is the standard prize for Homeric heroes. He says to Agamemnon, you take away my prize? I'm not going to fight. And he is the best of the Achaeans, the best of the Greeks. And of course, once he withdraws, the Greeks are doing badly, and the whole enterprise of the war threatens to collapse. And as he sits there in his hut, the Greeks, realizing their situation is pretty bad, send some messengers and say, come back, everybody's suffering, you're so good, Agamemnon will pay you back. Achilles says, and this is one passage, if you have to keep one passage from the Iliad, this is one very important passage. And he says, my mom, Thetis, the goddess of the silver feet. It's very nice how we have these very, very, very fine descriptions. And suddenly, this glint of silver in the midst of what is otherwise a reflective. I carry two sorts of destiny, and this is where we're beginning to inch towards our question of free will. Does he have a choice or not? I carry two sorts of destiny towards my day of death. Either if I stay here and fight beside the city of the Trojans, my return home is gone, but my glory shall be everlasting. You can read the Greek resume. Can you see this word that we've met before? Kleos and aphiton. A means no in Greek, and theo, to die. So imperishable. The one thing that resists the mortal condition. And you can read it here in the Greek. That's a kappa, a lambda. You know that from early maths. Epsilon, omicron, that's an S. That's the alpha, the phi, the theta, the iota, it's not very clear, that's a theta, and so on. So it says, either I fight, I live a short life, but my glory shall be everlasting. But if I return home to the beloved land of my fathers, the excellence of my glory is gone, but there will be a long life left for me. And the end, and my end in death will not come to me quickly. The point that I want to make to you is that this, and this is not just anybody who's saying this, this is the great hero of this moment. He's saying, remember the idea that man and the world are united? It's a common idea. There's the subject and the objective reality, or the world, the objective world surrounding him are one. But here he says, no. I have a choice. And that choice is not just any choice, but it's a choice that determines the whole, as I'm just trying to show you, the whole set of values, which, right, let's call them the heroic values, the heroic code that we associate with the world of that idea makes sense to everybody? Now, not as simple as that. Because the gods can sometimes intervene. I'll get back to this important passage in a couple of minutes, and I've got about 10 minutes to speak, and then we'll open it up and we can discuss. So there's another great hero, Sarpedon. His dad is none other than Zeus, king of the gods, the one whose will, and will is an important term when we speak about freedom, is the one determining the plot of the Iliad. In the very beginning, I'll show you the passage if you want later, it says, many heroes died, and the will of Zeus was accomplished. Dios, Zeus, the teleioto was accomplished. Boule is the Greek word for will. That's the same word that you want to will. Boule. So there's a question of saving, and Zeus really wants to save his son. You know, he's a good father, he's a good dad. Army, that it is destined, this is fate again, that the dearest of men, Sarpedon, my own son, says Zeus, must go down under the hands of Menoetes' son Patroclus, another hero. We'll talk about it in a moment. The heart in my breast is balanced between two ways, as I ponder whether I should snatch him out of the sorrowful battle and set him down still alive in the rich country. So this is the same choice as what? As what we saw before, Achilles. It's not just Achilles, but there's a question of let him die a glorious death, or take him away, let him live. Of course, you can't save him from death. He'll just lie, but he's still immortal. Whether I should snatch him out of the sorrowful battle and set him down still alive in the rich country of Lycia, or beat him under the hand of my son, of the son of Menoetes. This is Patroclus. And at that point, Hera, Zeus' wife and sister. That's allowed on Olympus. Well, it's actually, if we were talking anthropology, it's very interesting because the taboo of incest is the one strongest taboo which structures societies. And it's very interesting that in a few cases outside of ordinary society, whether it's in Egyptian dynastic marriages or whether it's on Olympus, sexual congress between siblings is not just allowed, but is one of the centerpieces of the story. But that's if we started to move off course, we would never get home again. So she says to him, if you bring Sarpedon back to his home still living, think how then some other one of the gods might also wish to carry his own son out of the strong encounter, since around the great city of Priam are fighting many sons of the immortals, and that's very true. Achilles is the son of the immortal. Aeneas is the son of the goddess. A whole range of heroes are semi-divine, and sometimes doesn't save them from death. So she says there are many sons of immortals fighting, and you will awaken grim resentment among them if you take your oath. Basically what she's saying to you, to Zeus, is you save this one mortal, you're going to ruin the whole order of the world, because chaos will rule. And the one thing that will happen is that everything we know about the order of the world, the mortal world, which in a sense is ordered precisely because it is mortal, will collapse. Now, you remember what happens. Achilles doesn't go back to the fight. The Greeks beg, and he refuses. But his companion, the son of Menoetius, Patroclus, they're often called the son of. And in a sense, by calling them the son, first of all, it's just their surname. But more significantly, it underlines the relationship between fathers and sons and this mortal progression of the generations. So, Patroclus, seeing the Greeks suffer, remember what happens? He says, I can't stand it. He puts on, he says to Achilles, okay, you're not going to fight, but at least let me fight for you. He puts on Achilles' armor, pretending to be him, and goes out to fight. At first, he does rather well, but soon enough, the great Trojan hero, the protector of Troy, Hector, the prince, the son of Priam, the king of Troy, slays him. And in slaying him, of course, he is vicariously slaying Achilles, because he's slaying the man who wears Achilles' armor, who is the person carrying the identity. And again, if we think identity in Homer, identity is only skin deep. You're the person whose armor you're wearing. So Patroclus dies. And at that, and only at that, does Achilles, for all sorts of reasons that we scholars have been fighting, squabbling, bickering about for millennia, in fact. Why did he do it? Why does Achilles join the battle? But the main reason, I think we could say, is suddenly he goes back to fighting not because he considers the question of glory, but he's suddenly fighting not because he wants to save the Greeks, not because he wants a prize. He's been offered more prizes than he ever could have earlier by Agamemnon. He said, no, I don't care for those. Why should I care if I have glory and short life when I can have a... He's now going back for completely different reasons. So yes, he's joining the war again. He is going to fight. And when he fights, he still is subject to the fate, as it were, that has been one of the fates. But he is making the decision, except that he's making the decision now for what we could call, or some heroes would call, all the wrong reasons. Yes, I'm going back to fight, but I don't give a, forgive me, rat's backside about glory and this whole system of immortality. He's now suddenly fighting because he's angry or ashamed or feels guilty that his best friend got killed by Hector wearing his armor when he should have been the one fighting. He's suddenly throwing out the window everything we knew about the values that predetermine one's life and death. And he indeed says, when he does, eventually he chases Hector around the walls of Troy, very moving scene, he kills him. Hector tells him, you kill me, you die too, because you'll follow in your own fate. And Achilles says, I don't care. Die, and I will take my own death at whatever time Zeus and the rest of the immortals choose to accomplish. And so we said, okay, this whole world has been turned upside down. The values we thought determined the balance of choosing between fate, life, and death have been turned upside down. Is that clear? Now that's very good. When I talked to you at the beginning about Homer being the best known and the unknown, it's a world in which we have rules as to what to do and how to survive or overcome, in inverted commas, the condition of mortality. But those rules go out the window once something really important comes up. So where are we? Why? I'll ask at the end. And Hector says, much earlier, to his wife, when she's saying, this is way earlier in the book, and Hector and Andromache, Hector, the Prince of Troy, and Andromache, his wife, and their little son, Astyanax. That's the one domestic scene in, actually a problematic scene, I could talk about that, but I won't, in this whole grim, dark poem of war and death. And it is a grim poem. If you've read some of the descriptions of battle, the guy is killed, and the spear cuts off his tongue, and his eyes pop in the dust, and his lung or his buttocks, or it's totally, it's not anatomically correct, but it is definitely clinical. Any clinicians in the room? But Hector is talking to his dear wife. He says, poor Andromache. Poor is really a bad, you can see it. Daimon, it's demon. Daimonie. When you call someone daimonios in Greek, in Homer, it's like, you're not behaving like a normal mortal human being. This is something different. And he's saying, now it's between poor Andromache and, again, to be a weird woman or strange woman, or are you out of your mind? Have you lost it? It's very difficult to translate. Poor Andromache, why does your heart sorrow so much for me? No man is going to hurl me to Hades unless it is fated. But as for fate, I think no man has yet escaped it. Once it has taken its first form, neither brave man nor coward. On one hand, he's saying a truism. On the other hand, he is perhaps speaking here, or at least we as the audience or readers of Homer, know that he would be talking about Achilles. We've just said that Achilles doesn't care about fate. He goes to kill Hector not because of fate, but because he, as one individual, has had his friend Patroclus killed. And what he cares about now is not fate, or Zeus, or the gods, or glory, or mortality, his or Hector's. He is just angry. Remember how the poem begins? Tell me news, the anger of Achilles. Everybody's angry for one reason or another in the Iliad. Angry at this, angry at that, angry that they took away your prize, angry that your friend has died, angry at being mortal, angry at absolutely everything. I once had a student a long time ago when I started teaching a course on European literature. And that student, a young man, very committed, got very angry at me, and he said, look at us. Our corrupt Western tradition begins not with beautiful things, but with the worst possible word, anger. And you know what? He's right. But maybe that's the ugly truth which we have to confront, in a sense, if we are to confront who we are and determine, and I'm skirting the question of freedom here, what we want. And just very briefly, this is Achilles, and he's repeating what Hector is saying. But I want to conclude with just two more passages. You know, I have classicists like to deal with texts, even though Homer is not a text. it's poetry. I'll maybe sing it to you. So I'll show you two more passages, but not from the Iliad, but from the other one. Homer wrote two. But he didn't write any. I sometimes fall into the trap myself. Notice. Let me show you what happens in the Odyssey. Now, we could talk about the Odyssey for a very long time, but I want to show you just two bits. So first of all, fate and Zeus. Remember how Achilles and Hector say, I'll die when Zeus says that I will die? Or the fate. Here's what Zeus says in the Odyssey. Beginning of the Odyssey, this is book 1, 932. So pretty close to the beginning. Humph. In Greek, you can see actually, it's very funny how you make these sounds. Oh, popoi. If you look at some Greek tragedies, Angus may talk to, in some of these tragedies, when something terrible has happened, the woman has died, the wife has died, or they go, pai, poi, poi, fail, fail. Lots of interest. Anybody hear of the comedy The Frogs? Aristophanes' Frogs. It's a long story. It's a comedy about Dionysus. He goes back to the underworld to bring the poet, and around the underworld there's a river, and frogs. These frogs croak in Greek. And they go, brekekekeks, coax, coax. And there are actually long scholarly articles about the reproduction of frog noises in the Greek. Actually more than that. What you probably don't know is that these plays, these comedies especially, were quite rude. Basically there's a competition, as in all comedies, between the frogs who make noise and Dionysus, who also makes noise. And the Greeks were not polite in their comedies. And the noises, you wouldn't see it in many translations if you run to the bookstore and get, but the noises that Dionysus is making in order to fight the frog are, well, he breaks wind. And there are, as it happens, scholarly articles about the reproduction of the sound of breaking wind in the classical Greek theatre. This is humph. Rather disappointing translation here. Humph, how mortals now blame the gods, for they say that evils are from us. Whose fate? Yet they themselves have woes beyond their lot by their own recklessness. Even now, beyond his lot, Aegisthus married Atreides' wedded wife and killed him when he paid. So basically, Zeus is saying, they're blaming me, they're blaming fate. What are they talking about? They're responsible for themselves. So much for the discovery of personal freedom post-Reformation. And just one comment, and then one more passage, and then I will get off stage, as it were. This Aegisthus and the wedded wife of Atreides, who is that? That's Agamemnon and Clytemnestra. In one of the most famous Greek tragedies, Angus, you might speak to. No, I'm not trying to.
One sentence on it.
That's to say, the most famous mythological narrative of fate is what Zeus is saying. Me? He's crazy. Him, his personal responsibility. And one last lesson. So the great Achilles, having died, having chosen to die for all the wrong reasons at the end of the Iliad, we see him, or at least his ghost, his spirit, his psyche, his psyche. I say psyche because it's a Greek, but his spirit, his spirit in the underworld. And this is the Odyssey and Homer and we and the text and the tenets, looking back at the whole question of heroic values and heroic life and fate and death and warfare. What does Achilles, the greatest hero, the one who does have, strangely enough, kleos aptiton, that's to say this imperishable fame in song. Nothing can take that away because the Iliad is there. What does he say when Odysseus, the hero of the Odyssey, meets him in the Underworld? And Odysseus says, "Oh, I'm so sorry, Achilles. You are dead." He says, "Don't console me about death, brave Odysseus. I'd rather be a hired farmhand, slaving for another. I couldn't care less about the heroic life. For a landless man, there's a slave, not only a slave, but the slave of a poor man. The poorest of the poor, who hasn't much substance, than rule all the dead who have perished." In a sense, Achilles is here, given the opportunity to choose, underline choose, the freedom of the will, everything again. And by his choice, which doesn't take away his glory, he at least says, as a mind, as a thinking mind, I have a choice. And it is my choice, and it is in a sense determined by me and not by the fate which Zeus already has. I think I'll stop here.
Thank you very much. Who'd like to say?
All right. This is not a joke. Rap is a tradition of improvisation in which there's a lot of violence, which is very close to the kind of violence that we find in the Iliad. And when rappers sing, if you know the late great Tupac Shakur, he died not from singing. He died in a hailstorm. He was a hero. He was a warrior, in a sense. It's a warrior culture. And this song of rap, unlike, well, now it's become the province of middle-class white kids, right? Since Eminem, am I talking? But the original rap, where you were really, the rapper was really embedded in a real-life violent culture. That's in some ways an analogy, and they had to refight it out every moment. And that's very close. So just to kind of talk. What?
Stand up and check if they've got a mic.
It's just two thoughts really, which could be really wrong. But one of the things you said was that free will starts with anger, which I thought was quite a strong thing to say. But it made me think about the question that was risen in the last session, that somebody said about, with the church, is it feeling or is it reason that these ideas stem from? And then it got me thinking, because you said, who is Homer? You don't know who Homer is. Why it was that Homer, if Homer was a person, it still exists today, and then other singers, writers, whatever you want to call them, do not exist today. So what this represents is the collective consciousness of that society, of an understanding of how they lived in that time. So if that's the case, then you can see that there there was something going on where they were thinking, well, you know, is it the gods that we're fated by? Do we have a choice? Do the gods have a choice? If we do something from our own point of view, you know, will we end up fated anyway? I mean, obviously a lot of the readings are, Socrates, say, you know, a lot of his plays and everything is about, well, what the gods say, and however much you try and avoid what the gods say, we'll end up doing what the gods say anyway. But it just struck me that there's a real sort of argument going on within this. It's almost the Society of the Times argument amongst itself. You know, what is it really about? Yeah, and that was just my original thought.
We're going to take, you can take some deep breaths and relax. We're going to take all raised questions and then bring it back in. And then Dennis, and then.
I just wonder if we've got a too literal reading of the text, because what about irony? Because I don't read it quite. You obviously produce a modern paradox here by ignoring irony. That little sweet Scalia in the Odyssey doesn't seem as convincing to me as it is to you. I read Susan Nine on similar the theme, and yeah, you can still have those tensions. But you're the classicist, so what is there irony here or not in this text, in this Reaches of Achilles?
Dennis, can you explain what an ironic reading would be?
Well, then he says the opposite of what he intends.
No, I know. But in this context, what would that mean?
Well, it would then mean that we don't believe him. We don't believe that he's acting actually independently in the way you're suggesting. There may be tensions into that field that he can end that way that he can't, even though he expresses it.
Okay. Take that one there and then we'll go over to you.
Fantastic lecture. Thank you very much, Professor. That was marvellous. For me, it's interesting that I think what you were saying and what the Seth Shines was saying was that the Odyssey, although it seems the start of the Western tradition, is actually the end of one of a certain heroic culture because it questions it.
Yes.
And it seems that with the Odyssey, with the Iliad, and with that other famous block, the other famous centerpiece of the Western tradition, which is Don Quixote, and that mocks chivalric culture. And in fact, it seems to me that all these so-called starting points of our tradition are in fact radical questionings of them. And perhaps then we ought not to be so worried about the role of tradition, because it always comes with questioning and reinvention at every point, even from the very start, or what we perceive to be the very start. So that's one thought. And the other thought, I don't know if everyone else felt this, but I've read the Iliad for the first time, and it seemed very unsatisfactory, because there's no Trojan horse, there's no Helen to barely talk about, there's no heel, there's nothing, all that's gone. And if you watch Troy first, and then you read the Iliad, you think this is all very wrong. And do you think perhaps
just what you should be doing?
perhaps do you
that's
think
what Homer wants?
yeah, do you perhaps think that the reason why this is so, or maybe it's only my personal warped reaction, is that we find it so unsatisfactory, like your student who said, it's so angry, what's wrong with it? And it's all these Greeks and Trojans hemmed in between the coasts and the Trojan walls, and it's very annoying and nothing's happening, and is that because it's so unsatisfactory and yet so radical in that way?
We'll take two more, and I've got a question, and then Hugo, you can come back briefly.
It's a question about it probably links into the translation, and it's the use of the word reckless that struck me, because that and linked to the recklessness and free will. And I mean, I'd like you to comment on how adequate the translation is, because what it then seems to suggest is that anger is in fact, is sort of foolish. But it also reminds me in many literatures that the hero, and particularly the warrior, often, for example, goes into not just anger, but I mean in the Irish tradition, Cuchulainn physically, his body changes shape.
Berserker.
Yeah, like a berserker. So in other words, rather like modern soldiers who get into an anger in order to attack the enemy, that behaviour on the battlefield is heroic, in fact is perfectly acceptable. Outside of that environment, then it becomes, or possibly deviant, and maybe antisocial or asocial. So I'm quite interested in that, that idea of what he is actually rejecting, and in how the writer is seeing that, whether it is in a sense deviant or whether it's expected, and indeed whether it is in fact truly free, in the sense that you're not actually in control of yourself, whether the anger is in a sense your reaction to the situation, or whether in a sense your reason is gone. Now, I'm afraid I can just about recognise the letters, much less recognise the words. But I'm interested in how far freedom is in fact seen as a danger. Rejecting that tradition is in fact where the problem lies. It's quite obvious that in a war it's quite useful, but then in other contexts it becomes quite harmful. And I know from some of my history that some of the poems are being written when there are in fact changes going on in the nature of Greek society. In fact, there may well be some criticisms of the heroic ideal that was once acceptable, or what once would have been seen as acceptable in a more settled society where you're getting trade and regular behaviour. This sort of behaviour then becomes antisocial, and that's where your wrapping point is, I think, quite useful. That behaviour, Tupac's behaviour on the battlefield would be fine, but in a settled urban society, it is deviant and isn't something that's heroic.
You're absolutely right. The first time
we're going to take
we got
you and then me, and then come back out quickly.
So I was just, I don't know anything about it.
I don't either. But I don't this.
But like how it starts with singing the goddess, and so like in theory we're kind of getting this like via the muses. But I was just wondering what effect that has on everything that you were saying.
Okay, I've got two questions. One, you said that Patroclus becomes this imitation kitsch Achilles because identity is skin deep, so he puts on his armour and becomes Achilles. Achilles then gets a whole new set of armour made for him by his mum and Hephaestus. A new shield, which we hear about at length, which is the whole pictures of man in the world on it. New set of armour, hat, leg guards and chin pads and swords. So who's he then? Right, identity is skin deep. Who is this new Achilles? First question. And the other one is, don't do it at length, but tell us something about maybe it's picking up on Ken's point, the animal similes that are very, very rich. We haven't brought in any of this. So lions, descending from the hills onto, men are like sheep in folds, bunching from their manes. Those lions are on their shield again, and the animal metaphors of Hector looking at you like a snake are very prominent throughout. So is there a comparison being made about how animals act on instinct brutally and how men act, sometimes with reason and sometimes without?
Read my new book, very exciting someone says to Oscar Wilde at some point, gosh, that was wonderful, I wish I had said that. And Oscar Wilde says, oh, give it a couple of years and you will see it, he said. But the point here is, I've heard so many interesting things, like this. I didn't actually say that anger is the origin of free will, but just watch my next book, and I will say. Anger is, in a sense, to answer also with regard to recklessness. Recklessness is humanity. In a sense, part of the problem is how to confront the question of the social. Our existence not as animals that live alone and without rules, but in a society, not like the Cyclops in the Odyssey who lives by himself and has no rules, but in a society, despite our animal drives. If you read Freud's last great book, das Unbehagenheit, das Kultur, the civilization and its discontents, that's precisely the problem he is confronting. The clash between the need to conform to, without which society will fall apart, and our uncontrollable drives. In a sense, it's almost the same inquiry. I could go on, but let me just go quickly through this so that we... irony. There's certainly a lot of irony in the Odyssey. Any number, I could give you any number. Dying, death, mortality. It's a little harder, but there is a whole. If you are willing to switch the term irony for ambiguity, open meanings, indeterminacy, and the poem does that at every single point. That is, every word, for example, this word kleos that I showed you. Are we talking about the eternal truth that is our one salvation as mortal human beings? Or are we talking about rumor that's here today and gone tomorrow? That's part of the paradox of Homer, the kind that I started off with. And let's go to the Muses. Another part of it, the singer in Homer, in this passage that I showed you, says, I don't know anything. And most significantly, at the beginning, he says, I don't want to talk. I just want to sit and listen. The person speaking, the speaker, the singer, he says, sing, goddess of the wrath of Achilles. And this repeats itself in the Odyssey. Tell me, Muse, the story of the man of many ways. As the speaker doesn't really want to, he is not a speaker. He's a listener. That's a bit of a tricky situation. So if you're willing to trade, now in the Odyssey there is irony. For example, the very story which one of the singers in the Odyssey sings about Hephaestus and Ares and Aphrodite. Hephaestus is married to Aphrodite. He goes away. Ares says to Aphrodite, your husband's away, why don't we play? They play, but the husband knows about it, sets a trap, captures them, and then says to Zeus, says to the other gods, now I'm going to go to Zeus, her father, and ask for all the money I gave when I married her back. And the only irony is that her father is his father too. There are endless ironies of that kind. Just going down the list, recklessness, well, we just, and it is antisocial, that's the problem. And the very first line is precisely a line that addresses this, because it says, tell me, goddess, of the anger and its devastation, which put pains 1,000-fold upon the Achaeans. This anger is an anger, and Achilles is a madman. He rejects the values that make up the world of the Iliad. He runs the risk of destroying this whole world. It's not, and in a sense, I'm not talking to you about Homer, I'm talking to you about a foundational idea that then trickles down in 1,000 different ways to Cervantes, to Don Quixote, to a whole range of works, to Virgil and the Aeneid, to the classical world, to romance poetry, to early epic in the Renaissance, to major works of literature in the early modern period, in the modern period, and right up to our present day. The Muses we've already talked about. The animal, well, the boundary between the human and the animal is a boundary that philosophers, anthropologists, clinicians, Freud and Wolfman, if you think of that famous case, political scientists, poets and novelists, because it's human and animal, in a sense, is the fundamental boundary, imagine perhaps human divine, which defines us. Aristotle, you remember in the Politics, says man, Aristotle was not aware of the pernicious nature of sexual gender biases. That's another separate subject. Aristotle says man is a social animal. Politikon, zoon, like zoology. That's precisely the point. Society, man, humanity as humanity is defined and separated from the animal world by its living. Politikon means not political, but living in a polis, living in a commonwealth, living in an environment that is not private, but that involves more than one individual outside of ourselves.
You're going to get next to you, and then goes there, and then we'll come over to there. To you.
It's a comment rather than a question. I just think when a contemporary person approaching the Iliad always feels nervous about the role of the gods. It strikes me as I think in that film Troy, the gods are missed out altogether, aren't they? We feel much happier contemplating these people and their interrelationships and their psychology, and like a novel, in fact. Though, in fact, when you went through the passages, and the passage where Hero is talking to Zeus and says, and almost like a political advisor saying, look, you can't let him off because all the others are one with it then as well. And it makes the thing more interesting and more complex to us. But somehow missing out the gods makes, for a modern reader, makes the thing more interesting, which I feel, is not the idea.
Okay.
Sorry, just on the idea of gods as such. Obviously, there's a plurality of gods here. In my limited reading, I couldn't grasp why the Greeks were putting themselves through this, unless their relationship was one of complete trust with the gods. I mean, if you look at their actions, the way in which Hector is forward into making a stand.
Yes.
It seems entirely capricious. It seems almost cruel the way in which these mortals are manipulated.
Yes.
Then you think forward to the Republic, in which Socrates is making a point about trying to airbrush gods, to try and take away the incest and violence and all of the stuff that a later monotheistic understanding of God would find so problematic. Achilles' Revenge is, you're saying that he's breaking the tradition, and this is a start of an anti-tradition, but in a way, he's still within it, surely. He never makes that full break. He's not just thinking back to this morning's discussion, he's still working in that universe. And I would say that break in tradition, surely it starts to come into much later things.
Okay, there's lots of hands going up, so we'll get everybody in, but keep them short.
Yeah, the point that you just made about Achilles and that whole discussion about how he is described, especially when he decides to go in, when his friend dies, he decides to go back to battle, how he rages like a lion and his mind is unbalanced and everything else. There's that much more, and I think in some of the readings that came out, isn't that much more about, what it is like to be human, if you like, in that you are imperfect, you can have passions, and the whole mortality of human life is what really comes to the fore, as opposed to the gods, where, and again and again it comes across, they can do anything, they're caring, they don't have any responsibility, they can just sit back. And I miss that thing about what Zeus said when, Odysseus to come back and say, well, don't blame me, blame yourselves. In a way, Homer, the whole essence of the whole thing, that whole thing about taking responsibility, or it's about man having the opportunity to choose, does come across, perhaps I'm reading history backwards, but, in relation to what the gods are.
Okay, and the back.
Yeah, I was just going to follow up on the idea of it as a kind of heroic critique that he kind of talked about slightly. I think it's quite important to remember that really Achilles is a major part of it. If we're looking at how heroism is portrayed, actually, for the vast majority of it, people like Diomedes and Ajax are kind of the more heroic figures. So I think it's quite ambiguous in that way, in that it can be a critique at the same time as being a kind of celebration of different heroic attitudes.
Yes. That's exactly the kind of
Yeah, I think it's quite interesting to view it in a larger context rather than just about Achilles and nothing more.
Okay, I'm going to work from the back down the front. So, all right, Jeff, you're the last one. So.
Sorry, just a very quick question. If you could just say something, which we haven't really discussed, about Homer in what it means to us today. Because to me, as people have said, in some kind of primitive form almost, it's looking at social, anti-social issues, freedom, and play. It's looking at all those things which speak to us today in a way that many other things written in many parts of the world over many centuries and millennia almost haven't done. I mean, it's almost uniquely central to what we said there. So if you could just say a few words about that, it would be interesting.
I'm going to take everybody, and you come back at the end and give me 5 minutes. Yeah. So you're not going to be able to answer everything.
No, that's right.
You can wrap it all up in there.
Yes.
Yes, no, you're next.
Oh, right. I wasn't sure who you're going with.
I'm just going to
I was just wondering if the discrepancies in translation, probably a really obvious question, how many discrepancies there are in translation? And if we're sticking to just one translation frame at one particular time, are we then not preventing the tradition of storytelling? That's one question. Quite a big question, really. And the next one is if Zeus says that fate has nothing to do with it, and then Achilles said that fate's got nothing to do with it, then what does that do with fate? Again, leave it at that.
Mine's a question about about suffering and the symbolism of the suffering there, and the distinction between a chthonic and an Olympian mode of suffering as well. Because you mentioned earlier about the sort of anatomical descriptions of death and dying, which is a striking aspect of the mode. But people never sit around and cry, or you don't get those internal.
Well, one of the big problems of tragedy is how do we enjoy? Why do we enjoy seeing suffering on the stage? It's a big. Sorry.
If you just say something about the distinction and how the Olympian orientation of Homer here, as distinct from the chthonic vegetative interpretation of death and suffering.
Okay, was it the Rabbi opinions?
This sort of links to the last point in...
Stand up,
sorry. This links to the last point and Jeff's point about sort of the relevance of this today. And what really struck me when you show Zeus's response in the Odyssey, and it's the idea of perspective. It's almost like a transcendental perspective, and so it really brought to mind sort of the Kantian endeavour of trying to reconcile between the empirical world and some sort of transcendent, purely rational form of knowledge. So I think maybe does Homer allow us access to this narrative sort of as at least the rudimentary beginnings of the split between the transcendental realm and the empirical mortal. Could you then bring those issues of free will today and agency?
Can you ask that question again in the next session?
Kant, especially his article about Clara, what the Enlightenment, he is the culprit. He's the one who, in a sense, wrote the narrative. I could say that, but I'll mention this in a word.
Just a quick point about fate in the Iliad is that all the main characters, they kind of have a stereotype associated to them. So you've got godlike Achilles, you've got swift-footed Achilles, you've got man-killing Hector. And seeing as they have these kind of attributes with their names and stuff, truly that suggests that they should fulfill these stereotypes, and therefore that is their fate for the rest of the whole story, the epic story.
Just picking up with the chancellor talking about Plato and his home within lots of anti-authoritarianism as or anti-tradition as you're posing because he is within a set universe, and I suppose that's true. But Plato does seem really against Homer, doesn't he? The real attack he makes of it, which does seem to be a feel that
even if he knows them actually by heart.
Was the question?
Well, that was. I suppose in some way it does. Does Plato's reaction to Homer shows?
Why
he reacts also.
Is there a question like free will and utilitarianism not played out in the fact that you know, the Greeks had the gods who were the immortals, and they themselves wanted to pass something down to history through which they be remembered. So in this case, with the heroic choice, he's constrained by the fact that he needs a life after death in his own history and his own, and in people remembering him. So is that where it's played out in the question of free will and the constraints on his choice of death, basically?
I think the Iliad basically is a public information film along the lines of something like Holby City that you see on TV on a Tuesday night. It's a cracking story, and it's got this definite moral message about where we are today and what we need to do about it. It constantly says in the Iliad, you know, as men were then. The guy picks up a stone. Yeah. They're fighting in armour, and then suddenly they pick up a stone and hit each other with it. It's nothing like, I don't think you learn anything about warfare as actually done in that period, you know, pre-hot fight, whatever. Because there's definitely different forms of warfare all within it that go over many years. But as men are now, two men couldn't lift this stone. And there's one bit which shows the kind of idea that men were so much better, and people were so much better in the past. My favourite ever death, I think, in anything. I've never seen a sequel in a horror film. I've forgotten what hero it is, but he gets a spear in his chest. And as his heart gradually stops beating, the end of the spear is waggling around, slower and slower, until the great hero finally, darkness closes his eyes and the spear goes still, having vibrated with the sheer heroicness and manliness of that individual. It's kind of, I think that the reason the Iliad was sung to people so much, and then people wrote it down, and then people kept reading it, is, A, it's a cracking good story, just like Holby, but it does have a real sort of public information message. It's like, look at us today. We are not the men we were. We're not the people we were. Perhaps we're glad to see the golden age of heroes gone, when gods could shag who they like, and it was all war and everything. But as we come to try and solve the problems that we lay in front of us ourselves, you know, which is over the period of which this is popularised across ancient Greece and ancient Rome, they loved it too. It's very much looking at the things that are going on now and saying, look, we're not good enough for what we're doing. We've got to find again that sort of heroism, that daring, you know, that sort of, we don't need to get it from gods. That's what I think it says, and that's what I think the character of Achilles means.
Can I just interrupt, because it's so called beg to differ, in the sense that I don't think that there is a message in Homer in the way that it doesn't say do X, do Y. What it does so fundamentally is it says, you've got a problem, you've got to think about the message, but I'm not going to give you the answer. You've got to keep thinking about it. It's close, but it's a different thing.
Any last questions? But this is my favourite. This man, Peneleos, caught underneath the brow, at the bases of the eye, and pushed the eyeball out, and the spear went clean through the eye socket and tended with the next, but he went down backward, reaching out both hands. But Peneleos, drawing his sharp sword, hewed at the neck in the middle, and so dashed downward the head with help upon it, while still on the point of the big spear the eyeball stuck. He, lifting it high like the head of a pocket. Trojans. But my question was,
what can you say after that?
Sort of on the point of the gods, and you mentioned it as well, in terms of Zeus does not go to save Sarkis, because to do so, to act freely as Zeus would disorder the divine world.
And the mortal world.
And mortal world. So Zeus hasn't got any freedom. The gods can't act. And it seems that everything they do, you might as well airbrush them out of the Iliad, in fact, because everything they do gets balanced out. Poseidon might get things going in book 13, but then he'll get cancelled out. You know, there is this force going on. So in a way, the gods are completely irrelevant to the story. They're just sort of colour, or they're just metaphor for what men are. You've got 5 minutes and you can wrap
I have a very clear answer on the importance of the gods in the Iliad. Yes and no.
Go on, please.
That's a Homeric answer, because I've been trying to explain to you. Yes, in the sense that they are everywhere and they make the decisions. No, in a very strange way. But if you think of the motivation, the motivators of action in Homer, why does Achilles withdraw? Why does Patroclus join back? Why does Achilles decide to kill Hector? Why does Hector, they don't do it like Joan of Arc for the glory of God. The gods are almost irrelevant, and in a sense it's a long story, and we don't have the time to, but in a sense the gods envy, Longinus says that the gods envy the mortals, because we, when we suffer, at least have the end of death to look forward to. They can't even do that. And in a sense they live their lives vicariously through the suffering of mortals to give meaning. So in a sense, the gods are always there, that's the yes part, and they are almost irrelevant to the real motivations, strange as it may seem to say this, of the Iliad. Let me just say this about the question about the value of Homer's name in 20 seconds. Why should we care about this long, possibly boring, gory, incomplete story from several millennia? Why should I care about the past? Why should I care about memory? Well, simple answer is this. Why should I care about what happened to me on the train before I came to this place? Because without it, I wouldn't know who I am and how I got here. And I'd be look, why should I care about what happened last month? Because without it, I wouldn't know, maybe that's a good thing, that I happen to work in the University of London and that I happen to have why should I care, and so on back, why should I care knowing about my parents, about their parents, about where I grew up, where I was born, about the history, and then going back? Because the past is our identity. Plain and simple. No past, no identity. So the question, it's not a nicety that learned, those of us who want to read books, look at the past. If we don't look at the past, we don't have an identity. So it's as necessary as, in fact, it is the present. There are arguments about that in philosophy. So it's absolutely necessary. And Homer, whether it's good or bad, is such a resonant, and you may well disagree with lots of the things, like that guy who thinks it's corrupt to start with wrath. We don't have to agree with it, just as we don't have to like what our parents may have been, what they did, what their values are. But without them, we would have no identity. And in a sense, like it or not, and I'm not in any way suggesting we need to like it, Homer is part of our identity. And that's the absolute essential answer to why Homer, and partly why the present keeps revisiting Homer. So that's the god. They are indeed cruel and arbitrary. So the idea of the good Lord, that's one of the innovations. I'm fiercely opposed to the kind of progressionism that Frank Reddy may have presented to you, and the long narratives, or at least any one single narrative, even as I accept them. But certainly the Homeric gods are not, they're not the good Lord, they're not the Lord good or wrathful of the Old Testament. They are these beings that are very powerful. We better watch out. You better give them some food and some offerings. You better not cross them, simply because they have a bigger stick. But that's a fundamental principle of life, and if you want, we could associate it with the bit of our existence which we don't know, we never know, we never will understand, and that's a way of putting that bit that is beyond us into a box and calling it. The God doesn't have many forms. Beyond that, I don't think I dare start arguing about the history of faith or religion in how many? 10 seconds? Yes. Maybe tomorrow. Translation. In Italian they say traduttore, traditore. Translators are traitors. The one good thing, I think, about translation, if you take it seriously, is you're always at one remove from true meaning. So you're always worrying, just as you might always worry about what is the right thing to do, what is ethical, and that's a good thing. That's an ethical value. In reading, if you know that you're not reading the right thing, then at least you're always worrying about what is the right meaning, and that is something good to do. And one of my criticisms against my philologists, I spent 3 years learning Greek before I was even allowed to get near a sentence, let alone a poem. And sometimes when you do that, when you're trained as a philologist, somebody will tell you, because you read ancient Greek technically, you know the answers better. You understand the meaning. Quite the contrary. Because I read Greek, I have more problems understanding Homer. And what I want, answers come and go. It's the questions that persist. So if I can hold on to the questions by learning Greek, for example, in my book, that's a good book. Yeah? So that's about translation. Immanuel Kant. Kant. That is to say, Kant, and perhaps before him, Cartesian, the Cartesian cogito, and the notion of an interiorized subjectivity. That is a major turning point in not the history of consciousness, but in the perhaps history as a narrative about who we are and what we are. And one of the things that Kant says in his famous essay about enlightenment is he precisely...
Stick to Homer. We're doing
he draws the distinction between commitment to tradition and commitment to reason. And he says, in order to commit to reason, we have to put tradition aside. And that's the point when these things begin to diverge. Much more could be said of that, and shall not be said. Stereotyped heroes. Heroes do have stereotyped names. Achilles is swift-footed precisely because at the end of the Iliad, he runs faster than Hector, and because he runs faster than Hector, even though it's the gods who ultimately do the killing in a sense, he gets the victory. The point is that the same word can be very different in different contexts. So although it is what we call a fixed epithet, and each one of the heroes has it, in every different context. If I say, hi, how you doing? Or have a good day, if I say to my daughter as she leaves for school, have a good day, it's one thing. And if I use the exact same words, but I happen to be in Buckingham Palace, and I've just been kneeling in front of an elderly, stately lady, and I say, have a good day, I'd be using exactly the same words, but they would work in a rather different way. So the point is the same thing, the exact same thing, can be some totally different things. Plato, we want to know. What?
No.
Plato?
One last thing.
Plato. Tradition. There is a piece of stone. 30 seconds. There is a piece of stone in Fellows Garden in Balliol College in Oxford. It is called Deborgilla's grave. It looks extremely ancient. It's a garden, only the fellows can go in there. It's ancient. Deborgilla de Balliol is the wife of John de Balliol, who in 1260, because John de Balliol assaulted the cardinal, gave the money for the foundation of a house of learning, which then became Balliol College. Possibly there's some disputes, the oldest college in this house. So here is a piece of tradition. You look at it a little more closely, and you see that it's no tomb, let alone the tomb of Deborgilla de Balliol. It's a bit of leftover masonry from renovations in the late 19th century. Traditions are the ploughman's lunch. Everybody remember that? You don't serve it now. I think now it's all gastropubs and everything. But the ploughman's lunch, which you kind of imagine, Chaucerian ploughmen having a piece of cheese on a piece of bread for centuries. No, it's an invention of pubs in the 60s, I think. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe it's the 50s or maybe it's the late 60s. But it's certainly not. Traditions are invented. The invention of tradition is a very famous concept in history. And that's what we constantly do. And that's what, when Plato reads Homer, he invents Homer again, which is why we get the paradox of Homer. When Aristotle reads Homer, he invents Homer. When we read Homer, when I talk about Homer to you now, I may be referring to the text, but don't trust me on this. Or rather, trust me that I am reinventing him as anybody else who is talking to you is reinventing Homer. And that's part of the vitality of the thing.